Hi everyone, you're in the Ether, and I'm your host, Cody Fry. Welcome back for Season 1, Episode 11. Thank you for joining me, guys. Greetings from the heart of the Western Cascades. Glad to have you and glad to be back in your ears again. Really excited for today's show. Spring has definitely sprung here and some warmer days are starting to creep their way in. Hope you've been able to get out and enjoy the view wherever you are. I'm still feeling my way around the West Coast a bit here. I suppose fumbling at times might be a better word for it, but I have been getting out and seeing a lot of pretty cool places lately. That reminds me, don't forget to follow the Ether Podcast Facebook page. I'm posting a lot of random, interesting, weird things and places as I encounter them in my travels around the PNW. It's a lot of fun. You don't want to miss that. In fact, in case you didn't catch episode 10, we just featured Oregon recently, so make sure and check that out as well. And on that note, guys, the Ether needs your support on iTunes and the Apple Podcasts app. Those reviews are so important. I get it. It may not be the funnest thing you're going to do all day, or it might be, who knows, but I promise it'll probably be the quickest good deed you're going to do all day. If you're a Spotify user, please follow us there. We're on all the major podcatcher apps. Make sure and follow Ether_show on Instagram too. Always posting fun stuff there as well. And it's just another good way to show your support. Every follow, like, and share helps. Trust me. With that, thanks for hearing my plug. I appreciate it. Like I said, I am looking forward to today's show. I've seen a lot of new changes this year, to say the least. And when you kind of hit the reset button like that, especially I learned the older you get, it really forces you to think about your own mortality a bit more. It's also caused me to think a lot more about just what kind of relationship we have with the universe. I'm sure all of you can probably think of several times in your own lives where you knew you were at the mercy of the will of the universe and you just had to let the chips fall wherever they may. And amid all the possible outcomes, the fear, the chaos, the doubt, whatever it was, everything ended up working out just fine or even better, right? And you got a feeling afterward that you just got a gift, but you're not really sure why or where it came from. And look, I have zero answers for you, despite my genuine interest in these topics, the research, the books, the people, etc. What I can tell you, though, is the universe has a way of providing us with what we need. Sometimes we have to ask for it, sometimes we don't. And I don't have a clue, don't even pretend to know how it works, but I believe there's an intelligence far grander than our own behind it. I can also tell you we do have evidence of phenomena that defy current human understanding, scientific evidence, and lots of it. I'm not saying we have all the answers. I mean, those are far more elusive than what these phenomena basically allow us to observe. But we don't have the luxury to play dumb and ignore the facts anymore. Right, the causes aren't exactly in plain sight, but the effects are all over the place. And personally, I've seen and experienced just a few too many things and synchronicities in my own life not to at least strongly suspect that there's something much bigger behind the curtain at play. And I believe we're part of that somehow. And though most of us don't catch many glimpses of alternate realities, UFOs, auras, or spirits, unless they're on Netflix or something, others do. Let those two simple words sink in for just a moment. Skepticism, disbelief, and denial, they're all irrelevant because various disciplines of science, universities, and most military organizations worldwide have documented and experimented with things like mediumship, ESP, manipulation of energy fields, mind control, psychedelics. Hell, if you really want something to think about, actual ectoplasm has been captured on camera. There's a ton of fakes out there, of course, and I'm not talking about the green slime from Ghostbusters. There really are a few early ones that, believe it or not, are very real and a little disturbing in my opinion. But frankly, guys, perceived reality is a shitty house of cards. I am sorry to say. You know it, and I know it, and that's why we build walls around them and deflect, rationalize, and dismiss whatever threatens to knock them down, because they're so fragile. And that fall is unpleasant, to say the least. I'm far from resolute on the kind of things we discuss on this show, but it's stories like the one we're going to feature today that give me considerable pause. It's from a book called Changed in a Flash, One Woman's Near-Death Experience and Why a Scholar Thinks It Empowers Us All. It's authored by the subject of the book herself, Elizabeth Crone, and Dr. Jeffrey Kripal. Kripal is a professor in philosophy and religious thought at Rice University in Houston, Texas. He has several credentials. He's authored numerous books. By all accounts, a highly intelligent guy who's deeply curious about a lot of fringe topics. He's become fairly popular among the esoteric podcasting community as well. I've caught him on a few episodes, and his work's impressive. He has a really unique insight and refreshing perspective. This book's about a woman who not only has a particularly unique NDE, not that they're all not fascinating, but this one's especially intriguing. She comes back from it all with a host of new strange abilities, and her life is never the same, of course. But the book is written in two main parts. Part one, where Elizabeth tells her story in her own words, and part two is where Dr. Kripal offers his subjective interpretation and commentary. In the intro, Kripal actually warns the reader, be careful with this book, not for the sake of myself or for Elizabeth's, but for your own sake. And I get it. There's a lot of really powerful stuff in these pages that speaks directly to our core. It's incredibly moving, thought-provoking, and it will definitely alter the way that you view some of these phenomena. After the break, I'll be back with a story that's all but impossible to believe, yet impossible to ignore. Stick around. The year is 1988. It's late summer in Houston, Texas. It's been almost a year since Elizabeth's grandfather passed away. There's a ceremony planned at the local synagogue that she attends, a sort of annual memorial where they read the deceased name during the service on the Sabbath and say a short prayer. It's a pretty significant event in Judaism, so one day Elizabeth decides to go to this trendy upscale shopping center downtown, one that she usually avoids, but for whatever reason this day is different somehow. And she spots this really expensive black and white dress and matching pumps at a department store. And though it's really out of character for her, she can't resist. I mean, guilty conscience or not, she has to have this outfit. And as soon as she gets home, she hides the clothes and more or less crosses her fingers that her husband, Barry, doesn't come snooping around about the credit card charge. And she describes her husband as the most cynical doubter she's ever encountered, which is really saying something, but we're going to come back to Barry. He's actually out of town on Friday, September 2nd, the day of the service. Elizabeth dresses the two young boys, Jeremy H4 and Andy H2, in handsome little matching plaid suits, and of course she's wearing her stunning new black and white dress. And they're running a little late, but she makes it a point to stop and take a photo of the three of them before they walk out of the door. Despite the growing possibility she's actually going to miss the service, something really compels her to take this picture, so she puts her brand new camera on the tripod, sets the timer, and smiles with her arms around the two boys as the camera takes what she refers to as the last photo ever taken of the old Elizabeth. About 25 minutes later, it's late afternoon and the sun's kind of starting to wane a little bit, so it's really big and bright in the Houston skyline. And they pull into the synagogue parking lot when, out of nowhere, on an otherwise perfectly clear day, a single large thunderhead blocks out the bright sun and it starts raining. As quick as it began, the rain starts coming down in sheets and quickly turns into an angry thunderstorm. She's parked a few hundred feet away from the entrance, and the service is already underway at this point, and she knows she's never going to forgive herself if she misses it. So, after some deliberation, Elizabeth decides to make a run for it. She tells her older boy, Jeremy, I'm going to open up your car door, you run to the awning hanging above the entrance, and wait for us there. He does, and he makes the trek across the parking lot wet but safe. Elizabeth climbs over the seat into the back of the car and gets Andy out of his car seat. And by now the storm has actually gotten worse, so she opens up the door, gets Andy out, and grabs his hand, and with her other free hand she grabs the umbrella she always kept in her car. She pulls it down close over her head, and in doing so, she's actually gripping the part of the metal rod that runs up to the top of the umbrella. Elizabeth only takes a few steps before she feels a sudden chill around her. She then feels a static electric light crackling and has just enough time to think, this is stupid. I probably shouldn't be crossing this parking lot right now in this thunderstorm, holding this umbrella made of metal. My wedding ring probably shouldn't be touching it either. And the next perceptible moment later, a small tine of lightning branches off from a larger fork and strikes the top of Elizabeth's umbrella. She knows she should let go, and she tells herself to let go, but she can't. It's just fixed tightly in place around this metal shaft. Next, she says the big one hit. A second bolt of lightning, much more powerful than the first, then strikes with an unbelievable amount of crackling energy, blinding light, and this deafening explosion all at once, splitting both her and Andy's eardrums. Elizabeth oddly doesn't feel any pain at this point, but Andy obviously does as he covers his ears and begins screaming. Jeremy, who just witnessed this from across the parking lot, he's screaming as he runs out to meet his brother. He grabs Andy's hand, and Elizabeth follows the boys as they run back into the entrance and into the synagogue lobby. The boys are beside themselves, usually very well behaved. They're both just wailing at this point. A man close by they happen to know rushes over to help, and he starts trying to calm them down, but they're both just inconsolable. And it takes Elizabeth a moment to realize, as she's observing all of this, that nobody's really paying attention to her. She also wonders where her umbrella is. She just had it in her hand, but it's not there anymore. So she turns around and looks out through the window of the synagogue door. She sees it still smoldering in the parking lot outside in the rain. Her gaze shifts about 20 feet to the right of her umbrella. And her first thought, when she sees her own body slumped over, lying there in the rain, is, oh my God, not the shoes. She can see her charred, wet feet where the soles of her new pumps used to be. The lightning traveled downward, of course, grounding directly under her feet, so the soles had just been blown completely off. Not to mention the dress is ruined, and she's pissed, but she's also really confused, like, wait, the shoes I'm wearing right now are fine. Inside the synagogue, she looks down, and sure enough, they're flawless. It's at this point, though, she realizes her shoes aren't actually touching the carpet. They're hovering several inches above the ground. Meanwhile, thankfully, there's actually quite a few doctors attending the service, dozens of them. They're right next to a major medical facility, so this is pretty common, and they've all rushed out toward the lobby to help. Knowing this and that her kids are in good hands, Elizabeth chooses to go back outside, more like float back outside, to view what's now effectively her own corpse. But she still doesn't quite get it, and she's still pissed about the dress and the shoes. She keeps thinking, get up, you're lying in the rain in a grease puddle. You're never going to get the stains out of that dress. All of a sudden, it hits her. I'm not getting up because I'm dead. Her thoughts then immediately shift to, I was so wrong about so much. She thinks about all the people she ridiculed for years for believing in an afterlife. As she looks at her lifeless body, all these thoughts just instantaneously rush forward like, how could I have been so wrong? I've lived 28 years and I've learned so little. Her rigid belief system she'd held for so many years is gone in an instant. Black and white are now gray. The sharply defined borders and edges she'd spent her whole life drawing are just blurring into one another. Now, a sad but perhaps important element to Elizabeth's story is she used to go into a sort of dissociative state during the sexual abuse she endured for years as a child at the hands of their teenage babysitter, who's now a registered sex offender. In a sense, she would leave her body in order to survive it and cope, and she makes this connection now and tells herself, you've done this. You've left your body before. She then senses a warm, inviting light off to her upper right. It doesn't really have a defined shape, as in it's not round. It's almost vaporous, like a moving beacon. It also seems to want Elizabeth to follow it. Fully aware now that she's dead, she knows her children are safe, so Elizabeth follows this inviting light. She then becomes profoundly aware that time isn't linear at all. Rather, everything's happening all at once, which we'll go into more detail later. She keeps floating toward this warm glow, which ultimately leads her to a gorgeous otherworldly garden, specifically to this beautifully ornate wooden bench. And she's just amazed by the sheer beauty of this thing, the scroll work, the polish, and the sheen of it, when she hears a familiar voice tell her to take a seat. And it's her grandfather's voice. The moment that she sits down, this bench immediately transforms itself to fit her body perfectly. She gazes in awe at all the incredible flowers and plant life around her. They just explode with color from a completely other spectrum of color, like they're alive. And the soft, familiar voice isn't audible. She's receiving it in her mind. But she's told that the choice to stay in this place or go back to her body is up to her. She can take however long she needs to decide. She understands this is her heaven. Everything here is tailored for her. There's otherworldly music, a babbling brook nearby, a mountain range. These are things that bring her great joy and peace, and she's deeply and profoundly surrounded by God and this unconditional, unspeakable love, and though she knows that she is dead, she's never felt more alive. She can perceive other humans in the distance as well. She's aware of them, and she thinks they're aware of her, but everybody's content not to approach one another. She soon realizes that none of them are alone. They all appear to have companions, like they're in pairs. Everybody's dressed in street clothes, more or less, but they all look so vibrant. Everybody looks so youthful and perfect. Elizabeth looks down at her own hand, expecting to see burns from the lightning strike, of course, but her skin and nails are just perfect, and no wedding ring either. She wonders who are all these companions everybody seems to have. It then dawns on her, of course, that she has one too, and that's probably what she looks like to them. Elizabeth questions at this point whether this is really her grandfather. She wonders if it's actually God, but regardless who it is, she knows even the mere sight of him would be too overwhelming for her, so she never looks directly at him, not once. Elizabeth claims she's in this heavenly garden with her companion for a period of 2 weeks. And you might be wondering, as I was, how does one spend 2 weeks in this place if time's not linear? She does her best to explain that eternity, essentially everything that's ever happened, is happening, and will happen, is all occurring at once. Now, Elizabeth thinks that perhaps she interpreted her time in the garden, or it was presented to her this way because it's the only way that she could decode the information later in this plane. And I find this part fascinating. I've long suspected that time isn't really what we think it is, but we need this linear time model, to make sense of our reality. We couldn't any other way. And she describes time, the past, present, and future as layers on top of one another. And they just keep extending and they connect and they're all part of the same infinite eternity. And so again, it's all happening simultaneously. She also finds that she instinctively knows how to read the sky in this place like a calendar by tracking various celestial objects she sees. This reinforces her perception, of course, that 2 weeks passed there. Now, interestingly, she says that time only becomes linear for her in this place when she and her companion are conversing. And again, she believes this is because it's the only frame of reference that's going to make sense to her later when she's no longer in this realm. In other words, it was linear for her in the garden because she had to remember it that way here. And her questions are met with immediate answers. As soon as she can formulate them, the responses are imparted to her immediately via this nonverbal connection they're sharing. She's told many things about herself, her family, and future. Like if she goes back, she and Barry will have another child, a girl. This girl had already chosen them, but not to worry though. She would simply choose other parents if Elizabeth chose to stay in the garden. So at this point, she knows, as well as she's come to learn anything else from this place, that reincarnation is real. And she already loves this girl, though they'd never met. She also learns that our souls usually prefer to reincarnate with the same other souls, as in living multiple lives together. She's told other things like how George Bush would become president and that the Bengals would be in the 1989 Super Bowl. Not really the kind of wisdom you'd expect to attain from a place like that, but this information actually serves later as proof that she was really there, kind of like a plant, that this place was real. Pretty clever, actually. She learns that each person's heaven is different. The others she saw there, though they may have seen a beach, a snowy mountain, a lake, or a grassy meadow, they were all in the same place, in heaven, protected by God. We're welcomed there by whatever is most comforting and reassuring to us. As for everyone's appearance, she understands that in this place, Our appearances are essentially projections of what we believe our best selves to look like. Her companion also tells Elizabeth of an impending divorce, that her marriage to Barry isn't going to be able to withstand the changes in her after she returns. She gets a feeling this might explain the missing wedding ring on her hand, and she accepts that, but she's confused too because they've always had a pretty stable marriage, not to mention the third child they're supposed to have together. But Elizabeth eventually decides she wants to be there for her kids, and that she wants back in her earthly body. This spirit guide figure cautions her about everything that's to come. Her life's going to be completely different, that going back into her body will be extremely painful. Because her knowledge and understanding had expanded so much in the garden, her soul had grown exponentially in size. He's going to have to quite literally squeeze and crush her back down into size in order to fit back in her earth body. She agrees to it, and he does exactly what he said he would. And it's excruciating, as if every bone in her body is being crushed at once, yet she also feels this warm, great sense of overwhelming love at the same time. Elizabeth then suddenly finds herself back in the parking lot of the synagogue Emmanuel. She takes a breath and feels every cell in her body come back to life, though her left arm is still paralyzed for now. She opens up her eyes and sees people rushing toward her. Disoriented, Elizabeth can't really understand how she just experienced 2 weeks someplace else, yet she realizes she's only been lying in the parking lot now for maybe a couple of minutes. It's still raining, but not quite as heavy as it had been moments earlier. Those attending to her help her into the synagogue and onto the couch in the rabbi's study. She's exhausted and in and out of consciousness. The doctor examining Elizabeth actually happens to be a white water rafter who has extensive experience treating other rafters who've been struck by lightning. It's apparently quite common, and it usually doesn't require hospitalization, if you can believe that. But he listens to her heart and vital signs, tells her she sustained a mild lightning injury. She'll have to stay off her feet until they heal, of course. Take it easy for a while. The paralysis is only temporary, and it does actually wear off a few hours later. After the break, we're going to find out just how much Elizabeth's life's about to change, as we also learn about Dr. Kreipel's take on this, as well as his very interesting connection to this story. Stay with me. Three months after her NDE, Elizabeth has her first precognitive dream about a woman she knows, just an acquaintance really, but it's very clear to her in this dream that this woman dies. She asks to know if it's true, and Elizabeth knows a pharmacist who may know this woman, so she goes to see him, and after a few pleasantries, she realizes the man at the pharmacy counter is upset, and he goes on to tell her about a customer who had recently died, and this woman Elizabeth saw in her dream. This continues to happen. Different dreams, visions about different people she hardly knows or doesn't even know at all dying. And one day she's frustrated and she asks, "Why me? I hardly even know some of these people. It's not like I can do anything to help them. What's the point to this?" And her question's immediately answered by this inner voice that explains it's not about who these people are. It's about proving to yourself that you can know, that this ability of yours is real. The visions and her dreams continue as Elizabeth struggles to accept and make sense of them. But if you recall, she was told about Bush becoming president, the Bengals playing in the Super Bowl. Those things, of course, do indeed happen, and they do help validate her experience, but she's still not sure what to do with these newfound unusual abilities, including the precognition, of course, the ability to sense, read, and interpret auras in both people and certain objects. She can communicate with others' spirit guides, as in posing questions to them and receiving answers. Since her NDE, she's also developed synesthesia, which is sort of like your senses blending together in a way. In other words, the ability to hear colors, see music, taste shapes, etc. 2 years after her NDE in 1990, she and Barry do indeed have their third child, a daughter named Mallory. Earlier the same year, she and Barry wake up to a phone call at 3:30 a.m. Dreading the worst, Elizabeth answers, and the voice says, "Hello, darling." Darling is what her grandfather always used to call her, and she recognizes his voice immediately. And she's not certain if it's actually him or just his essence being tapped, so to speak, but with his distinctly soft tone and French accent, he tells her, "You know where I am. You've been here. You've seen it." And she asks, "But why are you calling me?" Barry tries to ask who it is, and she waves him off. The voice says, "I need you to tell your mother something for me." Elizabeth replies, "Why don't you just call her then? I can give you her number if you need it." And he says, "I have tried to contact her, but she can't hear me. Since you were struck by the lightning, you can hear me." And the information he gives her turns out to be kind of mundane, but she agrees to tell her mom. And by now, both she and Barry are kind of sitting straight up in bed and wide awake. She questions the voice on the line, "Did Grandma find you?" Barry, who's mad at this point, says, "Who the hell are you talking to?" Elizabeth ignores him as the voice tells her, "Yes, she's fine. She's whole now." Her grandma actually had dementia before she died, and she understood this is what he meant by that. Elizabeth says, "I have to tell you something," but he says, "I already know. You're pregnant, and it's a girl, just like you were told it would be." And his voice is growing faint, and she can barely hear him, but he tells her, "I have to go. This is taking a terrific amount of energy. I can't do this often, but I will call you again. Please remember to call your mother and tell her what I said. Remember the feeling of unconditional love you felt here. Never forget that." She was told those same words by her spirit guide in the garden right before she left. He says, "You'll have this feeling again as soon as we hang up." The connection fades, and an odorless, dense vapor cloud then immediately fills the bedroom surrounding them. Instead of fear or panic, Elizabeth and Barry are oddly perfectly calm. Neither of them spoke as they just observed this. Then this bright red light shining from down the hallway pierces through the dense mist, according to Elizabeth, almost like a laser pointer. The instant this light penetrates their bedroom, the same overwhelming sense of love, protection, joy, and peace she experienced in the garden just washes over her. A moment or two later, the light and vapor clouds simply vanish. Barry then calmly turns and looks at her and asks, "Who was that?" Elizabeth says, "My grandpa." "Which one?" he wonders. She tells him which one and asks him, though, "Did you just see anything?" And Barry replies, "What smoke? I'm going to sleep." And they don't talk about that night again for 21 years. On July 16th, 1996, Elizabeth has her first plane crash nightmare. She can see the letters WA on the wings, and she knows there's 230 people on board, and all of them die. 2 days later, July 18th, Trans World Airlines TWA Flight 800 goes down over the Atlantic, killing all passengers and pilots, 230 people in total. And this particular vision and the situation overall just shakes her deeply. And she doesn't know what she's supposed to do. She gets struck by lightning one day, has this incredible NDE experience. One could argue an actual death experience. And she comes back from it with all these new and unusual abilities that she can't even wrap her head around, let alone figure out what to do with them. She confides in her husband, Barry, about this vision. He moves out of the house in 10 days, and their divorce is final about a year later. The marriage wasn't really on a good track anyway, so it's not shocking at this point, but it is definitely the last straw for Barry. Now, in the time leading up to this, she knew she had to figure out, some way to try to turn these abilities into something more positive, and she decided to go to Seattle, Washington for a week to perform psychic readings. And somebody had gotten her in touch with a psychic there named Nancy, who had coordinated this whole thing. And she's actually paid quite well for what Elizabeth considers something that's really easy for her to do. She's completely booked that week. There's even a waiting list to see her. She does all these readings for people and goes back to Houston with a little more optimism, that maybe she's finally doing the right thing here, but she can't help but feel like she's doing nothing for something. It does tend to physically exhaust her at times, but this ability is so second nature for her at this point. She's not really sure she's earning it. But she goes back the next month and has a rather unsettling reading with a woman who is diagnosed with ALS, knowing with absolute certainty that this person before her is about to die soon. Elizabeth can't bring herself to tell her. She evades all of her health-related questions, instead just tries to reassure her that she'll be happy and healed in heaven, that she has nothing to fear, she's been to this place, etc. But she feels terrible, though she's not necessarily lying to her. Elizabeth feels like at the very least she's misleading her by dodging her questions. At this point, she really starts to question her role as a psychic. It's no longer this enjoyable, interesting thing. It's yet another moral dilemma for her. Elizabeth doesn't go back to Seattle for a third week of psychic readings. In fact, as far as I can tell anyway, that's not something she really pursued too much after that. However, to this day, the premonitions still occur. Again, most appear as visions in dreams, but she has received a handful of visions in ordinary waking consciousness. For example, in 2003, she received a vision while in her car of an earthquake in Western China, but it wasn't actually a premonition of an event days later. She believes she actually saw that happen in real time. However, according to the true nature of time, Elizabeth explains that she's not really seeing future events because essentially they already happened. That's a fun one to think about. Fast forward now to 2013. Elizabeth seeks out the help of an Episcopalian priest who wrote a book on the Christian aspect of NDEs, and he really helps her a great deal in terms of contextualizing her experience and in recognizing that her abilities are a gift and not this heavy burden that she'd been carrying around. And she agrees to speak about her NDE at a conference at the Houston Medical Center in 2015. And Dr. Jeffrey Kripal is also invited to the panel to discuss her experience. And the two of them speak afterwards, and Jeffrey poses the idea of the two of them writing a book together about her story. And the rest is history. 3 years later to the date, actually, of their first meeting, Changed in a Flash is published. Now, Kripal has a couple of pretty interesting connections to this story. Not only did Elizabeth have a precognitive vision of their meeting, which, like all her other visions, proved accurate, Kripal's office at the university is literally across the street from the Synagogue Emmanuel, hardly a block or two away. In fact, it even faces the parking lot where she was struck. Coincidence? Is there even any such thing? We invented the word and the meaning, so perhaps not. And if what Elizabeth says is true, that's an emphatic no. Her guide even told her in the garden that she knew she'd be struck by lightning. She knew she'd experienced the sexual abuse, the divorce, everything, before she even incarnated as Elizabeth Crone. She knew these things, and she chose this current life. And this is what we've all done many times, apparently. Our souls come here to learn lessons in order to progress, each at our own pace. And the choice to reincarnate isn't necessarily ours to make, though we do have a say in it. To quote Elizabeth, "What the soul can decide is what the next life will be like and when it will take place. What the soul needs to learn in order to advance itself will be the strongest determinant as to where and when it settles in its next bodily incarnation. I was told that the point of reincarnation is to graduate, but that this graduation comes with a duty or a calling." She also reveals at this point that the companions she saw in the garden, remember everybody was in pairs, including Elizabeth, these are the graduates who now greet and guide souls who enter that realm. In other words, we reincarnate here in this earthly reality as we know it, as many times as we need to in order to ascend, ultimately to spirit greeters and guides that help others still on their journeys through different reincarnations. So on that note, what's Elizabeth's big takeaway here? What's the point of the NDE experience? All the horrific death visions, the psychic abilities. She says, "I'm convinced that it was an intentional, preordained event designed to help me understand the ways in which time, space, and energy interact. I believe that my experience of the garden has uniquely positioned me to understand and now communicate these lessons." And it goes right along with Dr. Kripal's overall message he's conveying in part 2 of the book, that basically we're all affecting the afterlife by having these discussions. What we learn here comes with us, at least to the immediate afterlife that Elizabeth experienced. Here's Kripal going into more detail on this.
There is this narrative of kind of belief and the sort of the literal truth of what she encountered. On the other hand, Elizabeth says over and over again that I saw what I needed to see and I heard what I needed to hear. She's very aware that these are not what I would call pure experiences, that they're being filtered through her own imagination, her own psyche, her own religious tradition. And this is why I think also she refused to turn around. You can't see God. That's rule number 1 in the Jewish tradition. So it makes complete sense to me that she would never look around and she would never see anyone, but that she would hear God. That's very Jewish too. What's possible or impossible in your worldview depends entirely on the worldview in which you live. It has nothing to do with reality. Reality is almost certainly way weirder and way stranger than you think it is. And if you live in a world in which we're caught in this linear arrow of time, well, then of course precognition can't happen. But if we live in a glass block universe like the cosmologists suggest, then actually it can. And so that's my point. I write about making the impossible possible. And what I mean by that is how reality shifts for us when we take on a different understanding of the universe or a different understanding of what a human being is.
Now, there's a lot more to this book here that I really can't get to for the sake of time today, including a whole list of plane crashes and earthquakes that Elizabeth envisioned, how she documented them, a story about a haunted necklace that, on its own, could totally pass for a Stephen King novel, the whole family history behind the synagogue, how the support she sought within her community after her NDE was met with dismissal, and how different beliefs among different Jewish sects either jive or contradict with her experience. Elizabeth also talks about her sons. Remember little Andy who was holding her hand during the lightning strike? He too now has unusual abilities. Jeremy, the eldest boy, he already had synesthesia before that day. There's stuff in here about her parents. The spirit of a woman, apparently between realms, also resides in their current home. Elizabeth's seen her, the dog, family, and friends, but she's apparently the type who goes on about their business either unaware or uninterested in the living, so there's really no interaction there, but she has caught a few people off guard a number of times. So look, clearly we're talking about multiple phenomena here, from NDEs, premonitions, apparitions, spirits and spirit guides, to haunted objects, synchronicities, and reincarnation. And I'm sure I'm leaving out several here, but I think it's safe to say they all appear to be, if not directly related, at least intertwined. The lightning strike didn't exactly cause the experience, but it was the catalyst that made her ethereal visit and everything that followed possible, regardless, quote unquote, where she went. That's consistent with other NDEs, of course. It's not really about the vehicle that takes you there, as long as it's a traumatic enough event. Trauma usually tends to be the catalyst to this other reality. And I say reality because I think it's deserving of that. There's more than enough credible reports and supporting scientific evidence for that to stand on. So frankly, convincing skeptics, that's not my job, nor what I wanted. I'm more interested in breaking these things down, trying to interpret and make some sense out of them. Obviously, Elizabeth's experience was influenced by her. She brought certain things with her to the table, or in this case, the bench, right? But there may just be some fundamental truths there for us all, regardless how we color our own afterlife experiences. This, of course, requires that an afterlife exists. And I think if you get past the wanting that to be true part and really look at all the discoveries being made, the stories people are telling, it's becoming more and more apparent to us that consciousness doesn't need a physical human body to exist. What becomes of this energy, our essence, soul, whatever you want to name it, is a fantastic question. But we're at a point now where we all need to really consider the implications of that. I'm not saying we shouldn't be skeptical and use discernment. It's really about striking that balance between what we know to be true and humility. Though I think stories like these are really insightful, I also think it's a mistake to take them too literally. We can't possibly know somebody else's experience because we didn't have it. We can only interpret the experiencer's interpretation. But you see how fast that can unravel into our own biases and muddy the waters? Hence, why I think it might be best for us to focus a bit more on the bullet points. We're not computers and we can't just objectively accept and store information. It's always going to be filtered through our own individual lenses. And that's the aspect that Kripal spends a lot of his time discussing in part 2 of the book. Again, I do wish we could go more into depth on that because he does a fine job of contextualizing her story with his unique educational background. But that would be a whole other episode. And what I really wanted to focus on for today was Elizabeth and her experience. I mean, you're already more or less getting my interpretation here, so I don't want to throw a whole bunch of perspectives at you. I think it might be more productive just to think about what this story means to you. You process it the way that you want to. Whether you think her visit was merely a hallucination or a dream, regardless if you can't see yourself in her shoes, it's the discussion, like Kripal said. It's about hearing these people out, having these discussions, and considering the possible implications as they apply to our own lives. And I mentioned bullet points earlier, so what exactly are those? Well, based on Elizabeth's NDE and a whole bunch of other NDEs, some kind of God/creator figure or presence exists. There is an afterlife in the sense that our souls are independent of our flesh. We exist outside of our physical bodies. Time is not what we think it is. Our purpose is to learn and to ascend to higher spiritual beings. We reincarnate as many times as that takes. There's always a warm, living, inviting glow or light. We feel more alive dead than we do alive in this realm. Voices and faces are familiar, like we've always known them. We see family and friends there who've died. We choose whether or not to return to our bodies or move on to the next incarnation. We communicate telepathically with beings who help us decide. They answer questions. The overwhelming sense of love, peace, and protection permeates every moment. We all see different things, different beings, and we each have unique experiences. And people change as a result. They don't come back as the same people they were before their NDE. And perhaps that's the whole point. Maybe Elizabeth's mission statement about her communicating the lessons she learned is what it's about. I don't think it's about religion, nor is it about converting people to be religious. As Dr. Kripal put it, it's about the true nature and future of the human soul. We all seek that knowledge. Again, I'm not saying go all in and believe every detail of every story you read or hear, but at least give people a chance to tell their story. Decide for yourself if they're credible. Then consider the possibilities, the implications for the rest of us, for yourself. Opening ourselves up to the possibility that these accounts are real, in the sense that they actually took place for these people, isn't easy, but I think we owe it to ourselves to try. That's where I'm going to conclude episode 11, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I sincerely hope you go pick up this book for yourselves because it's phenomenal. And again, there's a wealth of stuff I couldn't include here, and it's totally worth the purchase to discover the rest on your own. Thanks again for joining me in the ether. We'll see you next time.